and welcome to this episode of The Art and Design of Sci-Fi and Fantasy, Mystery and Horror. In today's episode, I speak with Shawn Malley, who's written a book about archaeology and science fiction. And he talks about various sci-fi TV shows, books, movies that use archaeology as sort of the basis for their storyline, how the past is used to create a story of the future. So we get into a lot of interesting topics. We talk about Smallville, 2001, Blade Runner. We talk about the Iraq War and efforts there to preserve archaeological objects and sites and that sort of thing. He says that's sort of the basis. That's where his idea for the book came from, was the stuff going on in the Iraq War. So definitely we talk a lot about sci-fi and a lot about archaeology. So if you like either of those two subjects, you'll enjoy this conversation. All right. Well, thank you and enjoy. I'm speaking with Shawn Malley, author of Excavating the Future. Thank you for speaking with me.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Chris.
So first, tell me, how did you get into studying and writing on this subject, on contemporary science fiction?
Well, it's been a kind of a long journey, I have to say. It takes me way back to grad school, back in the late '90s, where I was studying at the University of British Columbia. I started playing around with this idea of archaeology as a kind of image and metaphor for understanding history. So I'm a Victorianist by trade, so I was looking at the way discoveries in the 19th century really did create a weird kind of science fiction of sorts for Victorians, a way of understanding themselves in time and politics as well. How did specifically the discoveries of Syria by a guy named Austin Henry Laird in the mid-19th century, how this guy's discovery really sparked national interest in understanding, among many things, the ways in which the colonial world, for instance, operated over kind of vast periods of time. So the 19th century really saw kind of cousins in the Assyrian world. This is in the Middle East. And anyway, my interest in the way politics and archaeology function within narratives that were in some ways science fictional, in the sense that objects in the past really function similarly to objects in the present, in the science fictional sense, that things constructed in the past are really kind of technological things that become part of the narratives of science fiction that we see so often today in our contemporary understanding of what science fiction is. So that's kind of a long-winded answer. I mean, I've been playing around with this idea how objects live in time and how they fabricate historical identity, and these are often quite very problematic in terms of political formulations, and that's really the heart of my book.
Okay. Well, let's talk about the book. How do you break out the chapters? What sort of progression does it take from chapter 1 to the end?
Well, it's I think I start in a kind of commonsensical understandings of archaeology. The book has 3 parts. It begins with part 1, which I call Battling Babylon. I'm looking at science fictional texts that are really looking at the ways the Middle East becomes a scene for science fictional narratives, and how these narratives themselves really do resonate within contemporary geopolitics since the Gulf War, especially since 9/11. So the first chapter begins, I think, with a really, a very sort of straightforward and seemingly unproblematic representation of archaeology in a telefilm, Trip Reed's Manticore, which was released on the Sci-Fi Network in 2005. And it's a story. It's got a story about soldiers going into Iraq. The narrative begins with the looting of the Baghdad Museum, pretty infamous and horrific kind of moment in the Second Gulf War in 2003. And the narrative begins with that kind of problem. What does it mean to return to a place that we've called our origins? The Mesopotamia is often known as the birthplace or cradle of civilization. What does it mean to come back with guns to a place where that very sense of origin itself is so profoundly disrupted by narratives of conflict? So this science fiction it seems very straightforward, and what happens is these guys they arrive with their guns, and they find that there's this monster kind of unleashed from the museum during this looting process. So they very quite unproblematically kill the beast and restore order. So what I argue in that chapter is kind of, I guess, paradigmatic for the whole novel, that these kinds of returns through Hollywood cinema, through our science fiction narratives to these places of conflict really are enacting real-world geopolitical issues that situate archaeology not as so much a humanizing science, a way of unproblematically looking at time and notions of origins, but ones which are deeply invested in geopolitical activities, like occupying a space. What does it mean for the West to be occupying this mythological space of Mesopotamia? So this film really gives us an opportunity to enter into this mythology. And I think the book is interested as well as a whole of entering into the ways we construct history from seemingly stable points of origin through seemingly stable science fictional narrative or framework called archaeology. And so the book basically just looks at that idea, that central move, as it moves from chapter to chapter to chapter. So finally we're talking about cyborgs, these kind of meta archaeological figures for themselves, they accrue time and technological meaning for the future. So they're really projections of our present selves. But the kinds of cultural artifacts I'm looking at, say Prometheus is a good example, really are asking us to really question how we create, again, visions of the future based on versions of the past.
Mm-hmm. So some of what you describe brings to mind steampunk. Do you discuss that?
I haven't actually used any steampunk in this, but there's another book. Well, steampunk is a very popular Victorian trope. So we seem at this moment very very culturally interested in resurrecting the Victorian era and making it present to our imagination through cinematic media. Mm-hmm. Like I'm trying to think of Penny Dreadful. I think is a pretty good example of a pretty popular series that was running just recently. Mm-hmm. Our fascination with the kind of horror, science fictional genres that were really came out of the 19th century and are presented to us today. Mm-hmm. So it's no coincidence, I think, that our world, which is so steeped in science fiction, to understand how we live with rapidly evolving technology, looks back again to another kind of stable origin in the Victorian era, where we projected this idea of steampunk onto the Victorians, who were themselves struggling, like H.G. Wells, with what does it mean to live in a world of rapidly changing technological advancement. We just think of War of the Worlds, which begins with the narrator reflecting on ethics. What does it mean to be an ethical person, in a civilized nation, in a world in which our technology is evolving to the point of becoming Martians, these kind of extraterrestrial beings, at the same time as we were busy killing people off in the rest of the world.
Mm-hmm. So what other works do you touch on in this book?
Well, there's a number of things. I think there's about 9 chapters. Each chapter is devoted to a book. So I started talking about Manticore, this telefilm that I presume very few people have actually seen. If you happen to be watching the Sci-Fi channel, some Saturday morning, you would have seen that. To some more popular works. Stargate, the film, Stargate SG-1 is Chapter 2. Transformers 2, Revenge of the Fallen. I look at that in detail in Chapter 3. I moved through Part 2 of the book, where I moved from this idea of Babylon, this return to a very central place in our mythology, our cultural mythology, that being Mesopotamia, to looking at the trope of the ancient alien, which is such an important image in science fiction today. So I look at, of all things, Ancient Aliens, that show. Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull is Chapter 5. And Smallville is Chapter 6, which I consider an ancient alien narrative in the way that the show reinvigorates the Superman narrative through archaeology. If anyone's familiar with the show, Clark Kent discovers his history had been written 500 years ago on the walls of on the Kawatche Cave. So again, a very problematic origin story or re-origin story for Superman in the post 9/11 age. Then part 3 of the book, I call this cyborg site, looking at the cyborg as a kind of archaeological figure as well, a technological being, but a being that also carries along with it its histories of technology, its histories of artifactual production, and the material modes of understanding cultural identity. So I start with artificial intelligence. Then Chapter 7 is an examination of Battlestar Galactica, which is one of my favorite chapters in the book. I have to say, I really enjoyed that reboot of this show. So the show itself is Ronald Moore's reboot, is the kind of archaeology itself of the Battlestar Galactica universe. And I argue in that chapter that the whole narrative is really about challenging this idea of origin. So Cylons and humans the colonial humans are really, of course, versions and productions of each other. Origins stories have to disintegrate as the series progresses, and I argue actually that the whole series is a kind of long archaeological expedition to go back to some place of origin. So they end up on Earth, which is, of course, the origin of our species. And then the last chapter looks at Prometheus, which is again another kind of archaeology. Maybe this is the phase we are in cinema, or science fiction cinema too, where we're going back, or we're trying to create origin stories for some very, again, important science fictional documents. So Prometheus is the final chapter. So it's quite a range of kinds of science fiction there, I would say.
Yeah, and as you were speaking, I started thinking about, when you were saying about origin stories and that sort of thing, 3 prominent movies sort of also came to mind regarding that. So, like 2001, it starts looking at, in the movie it's present day, but really it's looking at an ancient time where they discover, the obelisk, and then it moves forward through time. I thought of Blade Runner, where they're actually, during the course of the movie, the main character, Deckard, goes to the creator's dusty old mansion where he finds the old original, synthetic beings that he created. Again, it's like looking at the old objects that came before. And then finally Star Wars, actually, the first movie, Luke is given his father's old lightsaber. Like, it harkens back to, like, here's this old object that shows you what your future destiny is. So I don't know if that fits in what you were, well with what you're talking about, but it just kind of got my mind going around that.
Yeah, you're quite right, Chris. I mean, each of those films, which are such prominent films in the history of science fiction, film and science fiction mythology, all use that trope. I mean, at the end end of the day, the very basic element that I'm looking at is the way science fiction narratives are constructed. They construct versions of a future that have to be in some way rooted in some point of origin, and that relationship is always going to ask us a couple of questions. Do we accept origins as deterministic for the future, or how do these narratives themselves, which pay honor and honor to these origins themselves, beg to be questioned? So, I think 2001 is a great example where we have a distant past, a near future, where the space age is playing out in this around this archaeological expedition on the moon, and then this future or this imagined technological future anyway, where David Bowman is going through this crazy voyage into the infinite and beyond, and then this evolution into the Star Child, right, where he comes back, the last image of the film, where this sort of fetus is hovering around the Earth, and we know from Arthur C. Clarke's story that the child is there to stop a nuclear war. So we have these moments of violence running all along in the film, and really 2001 charts, I would say, the whole progression of my book, where we start in a particular point of origin, a location. I think Mesopotamia functions that way. We end up in the present, where we're trying to understand these relationships with the past and trying to find out ways to better kill one another out of them. So we have in 2001 the whole tension between the Russians and the Americans, which are really just playing out those space age tensions, geopolitical tensions. And then we have this version of the future where these tensions are taken along. So we have Hal actually kind of exterminating humans, right? This artifact that goes right back to that moment when the apes picks up the bow and realizes I can kill. So geopolitics is invented at that moment. So yeah, each of these films are quite interesting in the way they present a world that I think we need to be critical of. It's too easy to accept this idea that we belong in certain times and places, that we garner identity from them. We always need to be on the lookout for ways in which that becomes part of conservative political agendas that make it all too easy for us to lay claim to alternate histories, to long and intense histories as well, that have existed over time involving many kinds of groups.
Yeah, I was also trying to think of an exception in science fiction to what you're writing about. And I thought I had it with Star Trek, the original series, where it's, they exist without reference to their past. They're reaching out to the future. But then I realized one of the major storylines in Star Trek, the Khan storyline, that involves an episode where they discover this, this old, dusty ship, the Botany Bay, on this planet. It becomes an archaeological thing, and it turns out that the Botany Bay and Khan represent the old violent past of, Earth's history, where they came out of the darkness, and here's Khan and his old ship, appearing again to create havoc in their current world.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that plays out over and over and over again. It's easy for us to kind of, in some ways, we identify, Star Trek is a great series. Let's give it its due. I mean, it was very politically progressive for its time, breaking down this idea of capitalism. It was a great one, of racial tensions. Really, in many ways, like Planet of the Apes, it was a series and a movie that really addressed current political tension and trying to come up with, I think, some pretty good and creative solutions through, again, this alternative medium of science fiction. But then again, these narratives too become quite conservative as well. So they direct us into the conflict, but also sometimes away from them. It's too easy for us to often look back at Star Trek, for instance, with a great nostalgia, and so that we don't actually see, the massive sexism in the show. I think is a pretty good example, for sure. So, how do these reboots address these issues? Have they changed? Are they taking on just new forms, or are they actually radical departures? Villeneuve's new Blade Runner is also quite interesting too, because what do you do when you have a self-conscious prosthetic being, as a Blade Runner? That really changes the game in many ways, I think. But then again, you have meeting a kind of very conservative character in Deckard. Has he evolved in time through this process? So I can't really answer all those questions, but it is interesting to see how films themselves create artifacts that are irresistible. I have to go back to it and play around with it. And what kind of new meanings are possible when this happens?
Mm-hmm. So I wanted to talk about how you did your research. Obviously, you chose certain limited set of films or shows. How did you go about choosing them among the wide range, and how did you go about exploring it further, your research?
Well, the texts that I chose all really have, I think, archaeology as a central premise for telling its story. They're not just like I could have brought in, say, The Fifth Element, which begins with these kind of weird beings who come to the pyramid, and they leave the fifth element there, and a key and a guardian, which creates a whole secret society. And the film in the end isn't really all about that. So the texts I chose, in really some way, are really gathered around the idea of building a narrative, a version of time and space through old things and the uses to which they're put in alternate context. So that was my basic premise. With that in mind, Stargate is a pretty good example, because here we have the technology that's required, the technological advancement, which is kind of a required element for any science fiction, is itself really just it's created as an artifact back in time. The SG-1 team discovers these things, and they become a way of building an entire storyline in the universe around the idea of old things that are actually futuristic at the same time. So that was my basic premise, and each of the texts that I chose to write on exemplify this, like Transformers. There's a whole series that is based on this ancient race living amongst us as artifacts, and they mirror and mimic artifactual production of humans as we evolve. So in the end, I think each of these texts are become versions of a story of humans' evolution, and how we try to map and understand and make sense of that evolution, and try to also be critical of those evolutionary moves by trying to imagine what we're going to be like. Some version of our future self is going to be like. So, what do we see in the Transformers? That is a good question. What have we always seen in Transformers? What have we always seen in this kind of fetishistic relationship with machines, and especially with machines of war? I think I'm moving away from your question here.
No, it's fine.
but my research methodology was Smallville is a pretty good example. Watching 10 seasons of Smallville, trying to find connections between the origin story in season 2 actually season 1. How do we connect the meteor shower, in which a destructive meteor shower that brings the savior to season 2, where Clark Kent is trying to understand his destiny, maybe as a conqueror. He doesn't know this at this point. I mean, he's a superpowered being, and he's unsure of what his role is in the world, all the way through to season 8, 9, and 10, where he's entering into a kind of hesitantly into a public role. What does it mean to be this being? He never really works out into that last conservative gesture when he puts on the tights and launches up into the air. So methodologically, I'm watching episode by episode and one teen breakup and after another. I can tell you, it wasn't easy going. For a 40-something-year-old man to be watching teen melodrama for 10 seasons. But through this process, what I ended up doing was kind of creating this evolutionary narrative itself, and trying to find those nodes where the Superman myth intersected with the archaeological stories, put them together and see how they worked against one another as well as for one another. So basically, this is what I did for every text that I chose to work on, and it was difficult writing about television. Actually, we were just sort of beginning to kind of media studies to understand how to write sensibly about a medium that itself really resists closure very often. When you're talking about 10 years, the Stargate SG-1, how do you make sense of 10 years within, the 1,000-word chapter, that sort of thing? Film, much more contained. We can write more sensibly about an experience that takes place, in an hour and a half to 2 hours or so.
So how much did you incorporate thoughts and ideas of the people who produced, or create, or wrote these different works, and maybe also fan opinions, or did you basically look at it stripped of those ideas and come at it from a different direction?
Well, this is definitely not a fan study, that's for sure. So that is a whole other kind of burgeoning kind of criticism that is emerging. So what does it mean for the fan base to become really part of the narrative too? I mean, I touched this on a bit with Smallville. It's impossible to talk about a series that is directed towards a teen viewership, or without talking about how the teen audience does interact with the show. So there's always a small element of this. My understanding of the way these films and TV shows connected to the world. Of course, there's the review world, so I was very interested in that. But your question is interesting because very much part of each of these chapters, as much as I could, I am interested in the technology of the film. How does film technology, sound technology, use of CGI technology, how does that become part of the storytelling mechanism itself? So how do old things become part of a narrative through the very technology of film, which is itself a science fiction, is futuristic, is a technology that has become part of the way we understand the world and tell stories about ourselves in time and space. So production is an important element of this text. So I'm not just coming to this looking for themes and ideas, but the way those themes and ideas are articulated by the very technological medium itself. So that's one element. So I'm very interested in, say, for instance, Ronald Moore's podcast about Battlestar Galactica, where he talks about how he's incorporating CGI technology. For him, it's a kind of a directorial. I mean, he arranges space. Maybe doesn't comment on its thematics, but the way he talks about CGI and how he's employing it becomes then another sort of field of representation that I can enter into and explore as part of larger paradigms, structures of storytelling itself, and the ideas that stories do convey indirectly. So the production is a very, very important part of any kind of, especially an important part of a science fiction study of science fiction film, and which is, of course, a technology itself, which is shaping our vision of the future just as much as it shaped our vision of the past as well. And another element or layer to this too is to also look at the kind of arrangements that are made between directors, producers, and the forces that are shaping geopolitical agendas around the world. So how does Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull play upon geopolitical relationships with the Middle East, with film institutes, the Jordanian Film Institute, which was created, along with Steven Spielberg, for instance. Those sorts of relationships really do play into the kinds of stories about the Middle East that people like Steven Spielberg present to us. Mm-hmm. Another good example of this is in Transformers 2, Revenge of the Fallen, the relationships between Michael Bay as director with the Air Force. Each branch of the military in the U.S. has liaison offices in Hollywood, so they promise a great deal of realism to films like Transformers, which is a science fiction, which requires the kind of grounding in the real world militaristic machinery for it to make sense to contemporary audience, so we can believe in the story. What, of course, is also being created in these relationships is presenting through the guise of realism, or the idea of realism, or presenting, bombers bombing things, is a relationship between the way the story itself presents in a kind of realistic, value-neutral way, the way the U.S. military itself functions. Mm-hmm. And it's very, on the surface, uncritical. So what that chapter tries to do is to look into that relationship, which is a production question, mm-hmm. and to see how the production questions themselves not just shape the narrative, but also invite questions about the political role of the relationship between the military and archaeology. And archaeology itself is, of course, has always played an important role in conquest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what part of the research was most enjoyable for you?
It's pleasure. Pleasure comes from those eureka moments where you're struggling to make connections, where things start making sense. And I think this probably goes for most people who are writing anything really. Looking through, I can think, for instance, looking at the chapter 4, which is on ancient aliens, watching I think 6 seasons of which I think is a very ridiculous show, kind of a ludicrous, preposterous kind of television show, which is presenting this idea that we've been manufactured by aliens, and there's a conspiracy to cover this up. Is to be able to sort of look beneath that kind of rhetoric, and even my own kind of revulsion at the kind of narratives that they're constructing, and trying to find out where these narratives really do connect to kind of larger cultural anxieties. For instance, the Maya, this whole cultural frisson surrounding the Mayans in 2012, if you recall that, the world was going to come to an end on December 21st. Mm-hmm. So this show really taps into that anxiety, perpetuates these anxieties by translating their kind of visual rhetoric into a rhetoric of fear, and that rhetoric of fear is we're talking about what's the most pleasurable. What is the most pleasurable is finding out how these images and these narratives really do connect to kind of larger patterns of fear mongering from powerful people, so that we can keep our anxiety at all kinds of levels, especially at the level of popular discourse, high, so that we remain obedient is part of the result of these sorts of stories. It makes them popular too.
Yeah. So what did you find in your research that was most surprising?
Oh, most surprising. That's a good question. What was I most surprised? I was just surprised through the entire thing. Process, I'd have to say, is just, I think ultimately the level at which the kinds of relationships I'm mapping out, say in the first chapter, are so pervasive in science fiction narratives that do involve archaeology, that we really can see in this entertaining medium what I think is ultimately the most powerful critical voice of conservative forces that remind us over and over again that places like say Nineveh or Nimrud in Iraq are almost holy sites. So the book ends, I think, on an interesting note where I'm looking at the ways in which there's this school in Oxford. It's a business, actually, the Institute of Digital Archaeology. And what they're doing is they're 3D printing artifacts that have been destroyed by ISIS. Part of ISIS's program, of course, is to whip through their places of conquest and create their own movies about destruction, all in the name, of course, of an iconoclastic display of destroying idols, right? But they're onto something, because they're quite right, because these artifacts that we've located and venerated at the origins of Western culture, which have, of course, have allowed us to have such important political and economic influence in places like Iraq and Syria. Losing my train of thought here. Yeah, these things have become icons or even kind of religious symbols of the West. They know this very well, and so these become very important symbolic targets of retribution. Now, I think that's a very legitimate political stance to take, a very legitimate kind of expression of dissent against the West. I don't, of course, agree with destroying these things. It's, of course, it's kind of nihilistic at the same time. What I do find actually quite pessimistic and nihilistic is this digital Institute of Digital Archaeology. What they've been doing, they're based out of Oxford, and they have government funding, and they have support from Oxford University, is to recreate through 3D printing artifacts that have been destroyed in order to present and preserve this idea that these artifacts are invincible to forces like ISIS. What does it do? It is I think it's a very conservative kind of gesture, which puts a kind of an absolute frame around these things, as if they are not part of conflict, as if they are not part of the narratives, centuries old, of conflict that hold so much meaning for, well, people like me who are interested in seeing how these things from the past really do represent conflict in the world. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does.
That is a surprising thing for me.
It's interesting you mentioned the destruction of artifacts. I recall reading articles where some archaeologists examined the videos closely and noticed that they were actually, in some cases, they were destroying fake replicas of the artifacts, and they were positing that they were selling the real ones on the black market, and then just, creating kind of crude facsimiles of them and destroying them for PR purposes, to say, here we are destroying the West. So that's just
it functions in the same way, doesn't it? It has the same effect when it becomes a fiction or science fiction, when it becomes filmed, when it becomes framed in that narrative. Props. These things function like props in a kind of a story.
Yeah. So
the other thing too is you're quite right, and by doing so, it also has driven up the price of antiquities, which are then sold on the black market, which of course are that kind of commercial proprietary measures or motives are themselves very destructive. Taking things and placing them in private contexts.
Yep, definitely. Was there an issue you came across that was particularly difficult to research or come to a conclusion on that maybe you still feel like you haven't come to a conclusion on, or just took a while to?
Well, I think following what we've just been talking about, something that I found quite interesting, really at the beginning of this this process was really the amount of energy and money that was invested in retelling the invasion. Really, I'm going to say the misplaced invasion of Iraq as a response to the 9/11 attacks.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think I'm alone in sharing this view. Mm-hmm. So the way narratives of placement, the narratives of justification themselves began to emerge around the stories of archaeology, and we've touched on this in our conversation today. One particular manifestation of this is I found trying to get meaningful dialogue with the Department of Defense and its archaeological representatives about what it means to follow armies. What does it mean for an archaeologist or any academic to be a part of the military structure and remain independent of it? And I think that question is an important one. And of course the answer is they can't be. So what kinds of agendas are some archaeologists themselves serving when they are part of the military structures that are part of reconstruction, that become part of the ways in which the kind of healing arts maybe of archaeology themselves become part of a story in which the return to Mesopotamia is itself a kind of healing act rather than a violent one.
Mm-hmm.
Trying to get those conversations going were difficult, of course.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Was there anything you discovered that emotionally moved you strongly, either positively or negatively?
Well, I mean, having researched, in popular cultural ways, the ways in which Mesopotamia itself has always been foregrounded in our understanding of the West, especially in times of conflict. Just to see the ISIS really going into places like Nimrud and destroying things. I mean, it is heartbreaking. One cannot help but feel a kind of sadness for the end of things being able to signify in any other way other than through destruction. So, no matter what kind of band-aids are put on this, no matter how many 3D printing operations go on, no matter how much crowdsourcing and 3D modeling tries to fill in those holes, they can never be. It was very sad for me to have to enter into that kind of space. It worked well, interestingly, for my book in terms of the way science fiction itself has created a kind of logic itself for perpetuating the past through simulations, kind of replicas that you were talking about, the kind of cyborg artifacts kind of working through the world now. It does suggest the kind of, I guess, the value of this kind of study that I'm proposing here. But it's hard to witness. It's hard to engage. It's hard to try to step back and be objective about.
So, what do you hope the book will do?
Well, I'm a teacher at the university. I'm in an English department. I teach literature and I teach film and media. I hope it's an example of the kind of lessons that I try to bring to class every day, and that we need to first of all, understand how stories themselves are created. I also teach courses in creative writing, and by understanding structures, we can understand, hope to be critical of those very structures themselves and the kinds of choices that are available to us as audiences. That we're not passive. That we can enter into the most banal of stories and try to understand, and to be resistant to the kinds of appeals that they generally make, to our unintelligence, our need for spectacle. That, in the end, is really what this is about, and I hope this is a lesson that this book is an expression of that larger professional desire that I have.
Can you speak to any difficulties you had in getting the book finished or published, and how you overcame those?
Well, these tend to come down to economic issues. I had this book. I think has like 45 stills in them. I wanted to have about 100 images because the book's always, we stop at scenes. We need to really analyze what's in the frame. That was impossible for copyright issues. So, I had to choose one moment, one frame capture, for an entire movie. Let's say Prometheus, so that was difficult for sure. So it is difficult. I had to go back then and rewrite a lot of what I did because I didn't have that image to bounce off, So that was probably the toughest thing. So that's how I responded to that. And then I had to throw my own money, or my own grant money actually, at the book too, so that the whole thing could be printed in color. So we have these I think pretty nice color images, which you can't really understand of contemporary cinema in black and white. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
So these illustrations aren't just illustrations; they're there as kind of critical tools. They're part of the argument.
Mm-hmm. Okay. What's your next writing project?
Oh, yeah, I've been on a bit of a fallow period this summer, that's for sure. I've been enjoying a bit of non-writing time, but of course I miss it too. I'm interested really in what can I take from this project and other kinds of writing projects and bring into the classroom, not just through my kind of private conversations or private moments with my own students, but to translate that into something that can be shared with other scholars who are, of course, interested in the challenges of helping students to see the broader picture in medium like science fiction. So I teach post-colonial literature here at Bishop's University, and one of the films I like to use in that course is District 9. I think that's going to be the germ of the next project, is to look at the way media works within that film, and the way science fiction works within that film, to ask some pretty interesting questions about the way colonial narratives continue to function in the world, and how and why they still exist in such a I'm not going to say alarming, but they're they saturate colonial relationships of one culture dominating another. They seem to saturate popular science fiction. So why is that? What does that say about our political relationships in the world? So those are the kinds of questions I like to bring to the class, and I think would be an interesting study in and of itself.
Mm-hmm. So where can people find this book and maybe your other thoughts and writings, say on social media or somewhere online?
Well, I'm not particularly active in the social media world, that's for sure. What you can do is send me an email, and I'll get back to you. My work exists in mostly university libraries.
Mm-hmm.
They're available nowadays. Everything's available through a PDF order, that sort of thing. Unfortunately, it's part of the problem with scholarly presses is that they're small runs, and usually university libraries with limited access buy these books. So that is an unfortunate reality of the economics of the business right now. But if anyone's interested, they can shoot me an email. I'll be happy to share.
So you have an academic webpage, I guess, where you teach?
Yeah, that's right. At Bishop's University in Sherbrooke, Quebec. You can find me there.
Okay. And the book, I assume, is available on Amazon, and Liverpool Press sells it on their site, I guess? Yeah, that's right. Okay. That's all the questions I have. Do you have any final thoughts or words? Well, I'd just like to say thanks, Chris, for giving me the time to speak about this work, which I'm pretty passionate about, and I hope
hope for viewers that they'll continue to ask really tough questions about the science fiction medium. It's such a invaluable resource for being a good human today.
Oh yeah, I agree. Well, thank you for speaking with me.
Oh, it's my pleasure indeed.
And don't forget to visit chrisalvarez.com or theartofsciencefiction.com for more great interviews, photos, and articles. If you'd like to support this podcast, you can do so with a donate button located on those pages. Thank you for listening. One of the best ways in which you can provide feedback for this podcast is to rate me on iTunes. Please give me a good rating if you like this, or feel free to give me a bad rating if you didn't, and I'll use that feedback to hopefully make this a better podcast. You can also follow me on Instagram under Chris Alvarez Sci-Fi, on Facebook under Chris Alvarez WLC, on YouTube under Chris Alvarez WLC, and on Twitter under Chris Alvarez WLC. You can also get more information on my website, chrisalvarez.com. Please remember my name Chris does not have an H, so it's Chrisalvarez.com. Thanks for listening, and keep imagining the future.